Hi, so this is Dan O'Donnell. Alex actually is not here because of some double booking that's happened. He's actually moderating a session with scholars from Cuba at a conference that we're having here in Mexico City. So my name is Dan O'Donnell, as I said. I work at the University of Lethbridge. Alex, who's helped contribute to the talk, is a digital services librarian at Columbia University. And we are two of the members of the executive of Global Outlook's Digital Humanities, which is a new community of practice that we established just over a year ago to promote global connections around the world. As I said, I'm speaking to you from the Encuentro Dos, which is a conference organized the first time by Red Hash Day, a Spanish language digital humanities organization, and this time has been sponsored by and GoDH, and in fact is the first GoDH conference, the first of what we hope will be a series of digital humanities conferences in what you might call the global south as a sort of counterpoint to the work that goes on in the global north. The talk that I'm going to give today is about surveillance and to a certain extent security, but it's one that while it does have a bit of a sharp edge to it as we talk about some of the lessons that we've learned in a negative sense and a positive as well, it's a much more positive story about how surveillance can work, or a form of surveillance at any rate, but it does have a sharp edge, and in fact it's the sharp edge that I think has produced some of the most interesting stuff that we've done. What I'm going to do today is discuss the early history of the group and talk about some of the lessons that we've learned about the coordination of global collaboration and indeed some surveillance. I think a couple of really important issues that we've discovered have had to do with feed. And in fact, the reason why I'm coming to you audio only to do with technological infrastructure as well. Could after that slide to be put up that I have a map, that it will be up or that it's coming up. I'll just discuss it a little bit. The map that I've got up is actually from Soteris's 2012 infographic, Quantifying the Digital Humanities. And it shows the distributions of physical centers in the digital humanities. This was defined by members of the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, or ADHO, across the globe. This is actually our instance of surveillance that I want to talk about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it formation of DH, and then how we actually discovered, in a certain sense, we were doing it wrong because we were coming from a perspective. Now, as Domenico Fermante argued, MAP can serve further activity in the field of digital humanities. In broad speaking, the residency members of the affiliated digital humanities sites make up ADHO. So, as claims that there's no digital humanities going on anywhere in the world, another way of reading that is to say that the places that ADHO recognizes are the places that are not yellow on this map. Fermante points out other things as well. Points out the blank areas on the map can serve as an inverse proxy for their data. For linguistic diversity, for example, areas in yellow on this map are, broadly speaking, with one very important exception, broadly speaking, areas that have in fact most diverse linguistic bases. The interesting exception is North America, because Native American languages, there's actually a huge diversity of Native American languages bound for language families and with some islets. But in actual fact, in a certain sense, you would have to see North America as being both colored and blank in that regard, because the contribution from Native American and Aboriginal peoples more generally around the world to what we think of as DH is actually also quite minimal. It's also blank areas can be also seen as a proxy for relative poverty. They include most of the world's lower and middle income economies, as defined by the World Bank. and in fact also the area that on the whole have the poorest technological infrastructure. So in other words, while practitioners of the digital humanities tend to define their discipline as both highly collaborative and highly international, it's for the most part that when we look around the world and when we survey the world around us, most of our international and collaborative activity is conducted along a primarily east-west axis among a relatively small number of mostly contiguous high-income economies in the Northern Hemisphere. So Japan, Taiwan to a certain extent, South Korea to a certain extent, Canada, the United States, most of the countries of Western Europe and Central Europe, and then the southern exceptions, the high-income economies of the South, Australia and New Zealand primarily, and perhaps as a middle-income group, South Africa as well. Now, lack of the connection between researchers in the high-income economies and the rest of the world is more surprising because the digital revolution the digital revolution that makes our field possible is also having a very pronounced effect on these lower and middle-income regions. So while internet penetration in the global, especially in the form of mobile options, massively outpaces that the high-income world. And in fact, penetration and growth rise considerably when you consider the demographic from which research are typically citizens with tertiary education. This population group, many middle, lower economies, the internet penetration rates exceed those high. Senegal, for example, tertiary educated, people in internet and growth demographics in the state. So the United States have a higher penetration rate and a faster population than Senegal is. Amongst the tertiary educated who have internet access are actually higher than the general population in Israel and the United States. Similarly, Uruguay, Puerto Rico, Macedonia, Mexico, Thailand, Serbia, and Honduras all have penetration rates well above 60%, again, on citizens with tertiary education. And that puts them in some cases among higher than some Western European countries and certainly some area in North America. So in other words, while the distribution of the physical digital humanity centers on Paris's map closely reflects the distribution of high-income versus middle, and lower-income economy, and the distribution of internet penetration among the general population in such regions, it does reflect either the geographic spread of the internet among the tertiary educated or the rate of change in various forms of ICT connectivity across the globe. Map figures would have far and smaller blank spots, and they would suggest the possibilities for a community of digital humanities researchers that's far wider than it currently seems to be. Now, this is where it gets into the question of the implicit us versus them that shows up in surveillance. Because as a graduate student of mine, Titulola Babalola, has pointed out, internet penetration and rapidly increasing broadband access are not actually the only factors that affect one's ability to carry out digital humanities research. Other factors that can affect such work and especially inhibit collaboration across economic divides include lack of infrastructure, especially lack of access to consistently available electricity or bandwidth, something I have to say that we are experiencing here in Mexico City, in an area that is a mid to mid-high income economy, and certainly when you get the tertiary educated in the main city. You can also have lack of training and lack of access to international research. And I think very important, something that Isabel Galina has pointed out, as T.G. Babalola has, different disciplinary self-definitions. So sometimes, in fact, people on what Galina has called the margins don't think they're doing the digital humanities, simply because they think that that's something that the West does or people in high-income economies do. And that's not necessarily a cultural thing. In many cases, what I've heard people talking about, in fact, it's often seen as being a problem of the low-income economies. That is to say that it's often raised in the context of people saying that we're unable to do this, we've not been properly trained, is a word that you often hear, or we've not had the access to the kind of scholarship that goes on. Another important feature of this, as has just come up, of course, is the domination of English as the language of communication, and this can lead to a largely unacknowledged valorization of Anglo-American research norms, genres, and interests over those of other traditions and regions. And this is, as has pointed out, that the really important part of the Anglo-American hegemony, or maybe the hegemony of it, but is not even so much that it requires digital humanists to work who are non-Anglophone to work in a language that's not their native language. It actually ends up valorizing certain kinds of research as the kind that the people who are most comfortable with do. And I think we see that a fair bit of humanities. And so what disparities and differences create is that researchers in lower income economies simply fail to see themselves or what they do as belong to the kind of research that's done in English language dominated areas by digital humanists in high income economies. And this can be tragic for us, that is to say, Anglophone digital humanities researchers in the high income regions, because the work is in fact something that merges very well with the kind of work that we do, and so is not even require much effort in terms of understanding the context where it's done. So what we've been doing at GoDH is working to overcome this divide. Fermonte has argued that the globalization of the digital humanities is going to be the true innovation of the next decade, but beyond even big data, mega platforms, and mass archivization of data, because of its ability to provoke a series of discussions on previously neglected topics: linguistic, cultural, cross-cultural representation, organization, English-speaking dominance of processes of discussion and factual evaluation, even the hierarchical structure, the way organizations are organized in our field. So what we set up is this attempt to try and bridge this. Now, initially when we did this, we started actually with Terrace's map, and without meaning to, I think the process that we set up was almost neo-colonial, in the sense that this idea that there are blank areas on the map that need to be discovered is very much the kind of thing that we saw during the colonial period. It's the kind of thing we associate in Africa, for example, with British expansion of colonial activity. Needless to say, we didn't consciously establish to do it that way, but I think that the thinking behind it was probably very much a version of the idea of the high-income economy, people trying to bring knowledge, bring equipment, bring understanding of how to use this equipment to the blank regions. I should say in passing, by the way, that this emphasis on the blank regions is not something that's inherent or not something that is deliberate about Melissa's map. She discussed this in the past, and while this is the way that it worked out, the reason why those gaps are there have to do with lack of reporting from people rather than an attempt to discover where people are not. So we initially saw this as being unconsciously, but nevertheless, I think in retrospect, we saw this as being a relatively colonial enterprise. We wanted to bring news of the digital humanities to the areas that didn't know about it. We quickly disabused of that, though, through our initial reactions. And in fact, the way that GoDH is now run is almost completely different to the way we initially proposed running it. I think it's fair to say that many of us initially saw it as an aid program. We thought that we would be perhaps bringing programming techniques and understandings of the archives work and similar issues, two areas that were not active in the field. But even perhaps more than that, I think, for example, to arrange for equipment donations or mirroring, something like that, to support people who were less able to continue work in the area. Once we actually came in contact with people, which, to be honest, was a very difficult process, because one of the things we immediately discovered was the biggest problem was not that there weren't people using computers in the humanities in mid and low income economies. It was that they simply did not belong to our networks. When we broadcast an email on any of the major humanities lists, simply was missing those people. So when we first set up GoDH and actually began to bring it into practice, our initial attempt to get members was limited to the people in the economies we came from, high-income economies in Europe, Northern Asia, and North America. What we found, though, was when we actually engaged into interdisciplinary mailing lists, for example, Africanist studies, Latin American studies and things, that's where we got the people from. And then the other thing we noticed, or that we learned quite quickly, was we had initially thought that the digital humanities, as a subject that is famously nice, where the practitioners are very collaborative and helpful to each other, we thought that this was in fact probably a strength of our field, and that we would be able to reach out to other people who were not currently in our networks, and because we're so nice, we'd get to work with them. What we actually discovered was that niceness in a certain sense can be a disadvantage, because it actually implies a community of feeling, a community of understanding, a community of scholarship that in fact doesn't exist. So what happened was our initial goal was to build a network of scholars around the world in order to create this global sense of the digital humanities. What we actually discovered was that was not the best way of doing this. What we instead needed to do was to tap into existing networks of scholars and act as what we call a super network, and that is to say a network of networks with trying to change the culture or the practice of the field as it works at the other end. Now, because of time constraints, I think I'll just go on to talk very briefly about some of the most important lessons that we've learned from our time in setting this organization up, and I have to say I still find relatively surprising success. So the first thing that we learned as we were doing this, other than this idea that we needed to do the super network as an infrastructure rather than a network, came up immediately with, in fact, linguistic issues, as one might imagine. What we decided early on was, in fact, to have no lingua franca at GoDH. In actual practice, of course, English is used by the majority of people, but we've actually found quite a strong willingness, especially among Spanish speakers, to communicate in their own language. This conference that I'm at right here, I'm not a very strong Spanish reader even, but although I'm on the scientific committee, it was conducted entirely in Spanish. The place where we did this most successfully, and I think is a model that we can extend to other places, though, came with the GoDH Essay Prize. And this was something where we decided to solicit essays from around the world. We had a small amount of money we could give out as prize money. And initially we thought maybe in English and a couple of other dominant Western European languages. But actually, after some discussion, decided we'd give it a shot of accepting essays in any language, whatever. And while I was initially reluctant to do that, I could see the administrative headaches that it might bring. Our actual experience was astounding about just how easy it was, in fact, in the community of people we had to get adjudicators who could speak the language. In the end, we had almost 60 essays in 8 languages, mostly European, admittedly. One, I believe, in Taiwanese, in Chinese. But we actually had essentially no problem finding native speakers able to adjudicate. At least one referee was always a native speaker, and we were able to find second language speakers who were competent in the language as well. And in fact, we had very little trouble coming up with our final list as we did that. The other lessons that we learned from, so one of the things that we actually did as a result of that was we then set up an approach to translation at GoDH which is quite different from the way that other organizations have done it, in that we do what we call ad hoc translation. The theory behind it is that in a community of tertiary educated people, which is the world that we're looking at, there's enough linguistic in the body and enough linguistic skills in the body that you can always rely on somebody with a strong enough sense of the language that is being spoken to act as an intermediary in the case of difficult or complicated work. And so what we do, we don't actually translate material when it comes, but we create a mechanism by people who feel a linguistic aspect of what they're hearing would be difficult for their co-language speakers. We created an infrastructure which translate. The last thing that I'll talk about, and I was just mentioned it really briefly, has to do with the cultural differences and how they show up. This is also a linguistic issue. It is, in fact, a linguistic issue it's a linguistic issue where the problem is actually the native English. And speaking of native English speaker who's had a fair bit of work in the international realm, I can tell you that the real problem is not people who are having trouble speaking English or understanding English. It tends to be English speakers who are not aware of the demands of international English. So while we actually did have an intervention at one point about the use of language on our list, the intervention was in fact entirely aimed at native English speakers, alerting them to the dangers of, for instance, North American cultural references, to make sure that they knew to slow down, to make sure that they wrote clearly, and also to make sure that they didn't write particularly long. So this is an early history. This is the early days still of GoDH. It's about 18 months old. And so far we've done, as far as I can tell, certainly much better than we expected. We began with a kind of surveillance colonial style overview of the entire world, in which we discovered that there were large areas of places, large numbers of places where people were not like us. But in fact, one, I think probably the greatest lesson that we've discovered from GoDH over the last 18 months has been that there's a richness there, and not simply a richness in the sense of celebrating difference and leaving it at that, but actually a richness that has forced the people in the high-income economies to think about what they're up to, and I think has can cause all the people in the low-income economies who were not part of the global digital humanities world to recognize the extent to which they also have a fair bit to give to, now I'm going to be a northerner, to us. Thanks very much. I think that's the end of my time now, so I'll hand it over, I'm imagining, to Jeffrey.